Hey, my friend, get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping into the world of European royalty in the years between two world wars, into the private life of a young mother who spent her whole childhood being moved from country to country by forces entirely outside her control, wars, coups, firing squads narrowly avoided, and who finally, in her 20s, found something that felt like a settled life. A husband she seems to have genuinely loved, 2 little boys, a 3rd child on the way, a family name that would one day become one of the most famous in the world, though she herself would never live to see it. She boarded a flight on a foggy November morning in 1937 that she did not want to take. She always dressed in black when she flew, as if some part of her had already made peace with what a journey like that might cost her. What happened in the hour that followed would leave a teenage boy hundreds of miles away at boarding school in Scotland, learning by telegram that he had lost almost everything left of the family he'd grown up in, a boy who would go on, just 10 years later, to marry a young princess named Elizabeth and become known to the entire world as Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Tonight is not really Philip's story, though. Tonight belongs to his sister, and by the time we're done, I think you'll understand why her life deserves to be remembered as something far more than the tragedy that made her famous. If stories like this one help you unwind at the end of a long day, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps a small channel like this one reach somebody else out there who might need it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you'd probably guess. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I really do read every one of them. Alright, let's begin properly, with a palace outside Athens and a little girl named Cecilie. Cecilie was born on the 22nd of June 1911 at Tatoi Palace, the royal family's summer residence in the hills outside Athens. She was the 3rd child of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, and his wife, Princess Alice of Battenberg, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. By the time Cecilie arrived, her parents already had 2 daughters, Margarita and Theodora, and 2 more children would follow, Sophie in 1914, and finally, a decade after Cecilie's own birth, a boy the family had almost stopped expecting, Philip, born in 1921 on the island of Corfu. Cecilie's earliest years, by every account, were happy ones. She grew up between Athens, Tatoi, and the family's estate on Corfu, in a household that moved easily between English, French, German, and Greek, depending on who was in the room. Her father doted on her in particular. More than one biographer has noted that Cecilie held a special place in Prince Andrew's affections among his 4 daughters. It was, in the fullest sense, a childhood of privilege, palaces, governesses, extended family scattered across the royal courts of Europe. But privilege, in the Greek royal family of the early 20th century, came bundled with an extraordinary amount of instability, and Cecilie's childhood was shaped as much by war and upheaval as by palace nurseries. Between 1912 and 1913, Greece fought the Balkan Wars, with her father serving under the Crown Prince, and her mother working as a nurse tending wounded soldiers. Then came the First World War, which split the wider European royal family along opposing national lines and eventually drew Greece itself into direct conflict. Cecilie and her sisters were actually inside the royal palace in Athens on the 1st of December 1916, when French naval forces shelled the city during a political confrontation with the Greek crown, an experience that must have been genuinely frightening for children who were, at the time, only small girls. The political chaos did not ease. In June of 1917, King Constantine, Cecilia's uncle, was forced from the Greek throne by the Allied powers, replaced by his teenage son Alexander. Just over 2 weeks later, Cecilia's own branch of the family was ordered into exile as well, out of concern that they might exert influence over the new young king. The family fled to German-speaking Switzerland, first to a hotel in St. Moritz, and then to more permanent lodgings in Lucerne, where they lived for several years without any clear sense of whether they would ever be allowed to go home. It's worth pausing here on what exile actually meant for a family like this. It wasn't glamorous. It meant depending on relatives for support, watching their political fortunes from a distance, and absorbing one piece of devastating news after another about relatives left behind in a rapidly changing world. Not long after their own departure from Greece, several of the family's Russian relatives were murdered in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Around the same time, the Grand Ducal family of Hesse, the German branch of the family that Cecilia's mother belonged to, and which would one day become central to Cecilia's own life, was overthrown along with every other German monarchy during the upheavals of 1918 and 1919. For a girl not yet 10 years old, exile in Lucerne meant learning, gradually, and from the safety of Switzerland, that the world she'd been born into was disappearing piece by piece. Still, there were lighter moments even in exile, reunions with cousins, long mountain walks, a warm friendship developing with her younger sister Sophie that would carry into adulthood. And in October 1920, an unexpected and tragic turn briefly opened the door back to Greece. King Alexander, Cecilia's young cousin who now sat on the throne, was bitten by a pet monkey during a walk at Tatoi. The wound, poorly treated, developed into sepsis, and 3 weeks later, the king was dead. The resulting political crisis eventually brought Constantine back to the throne and brought Cecilia's own family home. In November 1920, Prince Andrew returned to Athens to a triumphant welcome, and his wife and daughters joined him days later. It was back home in Greece, settled once more at the family's villa on Corfu, that Princess Alice discovered she was pregnant again. On the 10th of June, 1921, Cecilie and her sisters welcomed a baby brother, Philip. If you're picturing a storybook ending here, the family restored, a new baby, peace at last, I'm sorry to tell you that Greek royal politics rarely allowed for storybook endings in this period. The joy of Philip's birth was already shadowed by his father's absence. Prince Andrew was away serving with Greek forces during the disastrous military campaign in Asia Minor, and worse was still to come. In September 1922, following a catastrophic military defeat against Turkey, King Constantine abdicated for the second time. A month later, Prince Andrew, Cecilia's father, was arrested and put on trial before a military tribunal, which held him personally responsible for the defeat at the Battle of the Sakarya. He came within a hair's breadth of execution, saved only by urgent diplomatic pressure from foreign governments, most notably Britain. He was instead sentenced to permanent banishment from Greece and stripped of his military rank. In early December 1922, the family fled Greece for the second time in 5 years, this time not merely into political exile, but running, in genuine fear for Prince Andrew's life, aboard the British warship HMS Calypso. Cecilie was 11 years old. Her infant brother Philip, according to family law that has since become one of the more famous details of his own biography, was carried aboard in a cot fashioned from an empty orange crate. After a journey through Italy, France and Britain, the family eventually settled in 1923 in Saint-Cloud, just outside Paris, in a house next door to Princess Marie Bonaparte, a wealthy and generous relative who, along with the family's aunt, Lady Louise Mountbatten, effectively supported the household for years. Cecilie's parents, stripped of their income and their homeland, had very little money of their own, and the children grew up acutely aware of it. Hand-me-down clothes from a fashionable aunt, tuition paid quietly by a sympathetic cousin, a household that depended, in ways a young princess wasn't necessarily meant to notice, on the kindness of relatives. And then, on top of everything else, in March 1924, the newly declared Second Hellenic Republic formally stripped the family of their Greek nationality altogether. They became stateless in the most literal sense, until their cousin King Christian X of Denmark stepped in and issued them Danish passports. Despite all of this, Cecilie's teenage years in St. Cloud were, by most accounts, reasonably content. Tennis with her father in the Bois de Boulogne, Sunday lunches with generous relatives, a slate of European weddings, and family funerals that took her back and forth across the Channel with some regularity. She was a bridesmaid for her Aunt Louise Mountbatten's wedding to the future King of Sweden in 1923. She was back in England in 1925 for the funeral of her great-aunt, Queen Alexandra. She made her formal debut in British society in the summer of 1928, described by her own grandmother as the prettiest of Andrew and Alice's 4 daughters, attending her first ball at Bridgewater House, Cowes Week, and a stay at Balmoral as a guest of King George V himself. It's easy to read a life like this, palaces and Cowes Week and society balls, as simply a return to the privilege she'd been born into. But it's worth remembering that underneath the debutante balls, this was still a girl whose family had been exiled twice, whose father had narrowly avoided a firing squad, and whose mother, that same year, was about to suffer a mental collapse that would upend the family all over again. In 1928, following the celebration of her parents' silver wedding anniversary, Princess Alice's mental health deteriorated sharply. She began to believe she possessed healing powers, that she was receiving divine communications about suitable husbands for her daughters, and eventually that she was, in a literal sense, the bride of Christ. It was a genuine psychiatric crisis, and Prince Andrew, unable to manage it, eventually made the difficult decision to have her committed to a sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, a decision he carried out with a kind of grim practicality, while the family happened to be in Darmstadt in the spring of 1930 to celebrate Cecilia's own official engagement. That engagement had been building for some time. Cecilie had known her Hessian cousins, Georg Donatus and Louis, since childhood. She'd first met them properly back in 1919, during the family's exile in Switzerland. Her romance with Georg Donatus, the pretender to the throne of the old Grand Duchy of Hesse, developed through 1929, and the two became unofficially engaged in early 1930, when Cecilie was 18 and Georg Donatus 23. It was, from what can be reconstructed, a genuinely happy match, arranged within the natural orbit of a large, interconnected royal family, but built on real affection rather than pure political convenience. Cicely's younger sister Sophie became engaged at almost the same time to another member of the Hesse family, Prince Christoph, and the two sisters prepared for their weddings together, shopping for trousseaux and wedding dresses in Paris and London in the spring of 1930. Sophie married first, in December 1930. Cecilie's own wedding to Georg Donatus took place at the Neue Palais in Darmstadt on the 2nd of February 1931, a double religious ceremony, both Greek Orthodox and Lutheran, drawing around 50 guests from royal houses across Europe. To everyone's surprise, the local population, descendants of a citizenry that had deposed the Hessian Grand Dukes just over a decade earlier, turned out in genuine enthusiasm to see their former princely family celebrate. The one significant absence from the day was Cecilie's own mother, still hospitalized in Switzerland. After the wedding, Cecilie and Georg Donatus settled at Schloss Wolfsgarten, the family's main residence since their political deposition, and built what appears to have been a comfortable, relatively unassuming domestic life, punctuated, as royal life so often was, by frequent travel. Cecilie threw herself into charitable work, eventually heading a women's welfare association founded by her mother-in-law, and the children arrived in fairly quick succession: Ludwig in October 1931, Alexander in April 1933, and finally a daughter, Johanna, in September 1936. Throughout these years, Cecilie remained quietly devoted to her institutionalized mother, writing to her steadily, even as Alice, furious at having been committed, occasionally lashed out, at one point tearing up a photograph Cecilie had sent her of her first newborn son. It wasn't until December 1936, after nearly 4 years of self-imposed distance following her release, that Alice finally made the decision to reconnect with her family, and it was Cecilie she reached out to first. Mother and daughter were reunited in Bonn in the spring of 1937, and by that July they had met again in Salem, their relationship, at long last, returning to something like normal. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment. After everything, the institutionalization, the years of estrangement, the anger, it was Cecilie who rebuilt the bridge to her mother, only months before her own death would, in a strange and terrible way, complete Alice's own recovery. More on that shortly. Now we arrive at the part of this story that requires a harder kind of honesty, because it doesn't fit the tidy narrative of a doomed young princess and her happy family. In May 1937, Georg Donatus and his brother Louis joined the Nazi Party. Their family had kept its distance from the far-right movement for years. The boy's own father, the deposed Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig, reportedly had no sympathy for Hitler's ideology. But by 1937, with the Nazi state now the only political reality in Germany, that resistance had eroded. Following her husband's lead, Cecilie joined the party at the same time. I want to be careful here, because this detail is sometimes flattened into something simpler than it actually was. Cecilie was not, by the fragments of the historical record available to us, an ideological true believer in the way that some of her in-laws clearly were. Her brother-in-law, Prince Christoph, Sophie's husband, had joined the Nazi Party years earlier, in 1931, and the SS the following year, and would go on to hold a position in the Air Ministry under the Third Reich. What Cecilie's own party membership represented is harder to say with certainty. The historical record simply doesn't give us access to her private convictions the way it does for some of her in-laws. What we can say is that by the autumn of 1937, the family Cecilie had married into was, in various and uneven ways, entangled with the regime that would soon plunge Europe into catastrophe, and that this entanglement forms an uncomfortable but inseparable part of her story, one that later generations, including her own brother, would spend years trying to reckon with. Meanwhile, ordinary family life continued alongside the political shifts. In 1937, Cecilie became pregnant with her 4th child. At the same time, her father-in-law's health was failing rapidly. Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig had lung cancer, and he was hoping fervently to live long enough to see his second son Louis married to a British woman, the Honourable Margaret Campbell Geddes, in a wedding planned for London in late October. He didn't make it. Ernst Ludwig died on the 9th of October 1937, a fortnight before the planned ceremony, making Georg Donatus, Cecilia's husband, the new head of the House of Hesse-Darmstadt. Louis's wedding was postponed to allow time for his father's funeral, rescheduled for the 20th of November instead. And so, on the 16th of November 1937, Cecilie, 8 months pregnant, travelled with her husband, her mother-in-law, the Dowager Grand Duchess Eleanor, and her 2 sons, 6-year-old Ludwig and 4-year-old Alexander, to Frankfurt, where they boarded a Sabena airliner bound for London by way of a scheduled stop in Ostend, Belgium. Baby Johanna, still just over a year old, was left behind. 2 additional passengers joined them, Baron Joachim von Riedesel, chosen to stand as witness at Louis' wedding, and a young woman named Alice Hahn. According to Philip Eade, one of the more careful biographers to write about this period, Cecilie had always hated flying and had a habit of dressing in black whenever she was forced to travel by air, as though some private part of her had made a quiet peace with the possibility this journey represented. The flight began under ordinary conditions, but as the aircraft approached the Belgian coast, a thick fog rolled in off the North Sea, and visibility dropped sharply. Rather than diverting, the pilot continued following the flight plan and attempted to land at Ostend's Steen airfield, despite the poor conditions. During the descent, the plane struck the chimney of a nearby factory. The impact tore away a wing and an engine. The aircraft crashed onto the roof of a building, was thrown several meters further, and caught fire. Everyone aboard was killed instantly: Cecilie, her husband Georg Donatus, their 2 young sons, her mother-in-law, and the additional passengers and crew. Belgian newspapers reporting on the crash in the days that followed noted something almost unbearably sad amid the wreckage. Evidence suggested that Cecilie, in the plane's final moments, had gone into labour, and that her 4th child, the baby she had carried through this entire final journey, had been born, briefly, into the same catastrophe that claimed the rest of the family. Back in London, Prince Louis received the news the day before his own wedding. He chose, in circumstances that are difficult to fully imagine, to go ahead with the ceremony as planned, marrying Margaret Campbell Geddes the following day, the 17th of November, in a wedding that proceeded under a suffocating cloud of grief, the guests dressed in mourning rather than celebration. Immediately afterward, the newly married couple travelled to Belgium to identify and collect the remains of Louis's brother and his entire family from the civil hospital in Ostend, where the bodies had been kept. Cecilie Georg Donatus, their 2 sons, and Grand Duchess Eleanor were brought back to Darmstadt and buried together in the Grand Ducal family vault at Rosenhoer Park on the 23rd of November, 1937, barely a week after the crash, and not far from the grave of Cecilie's own father-in-law, whose funeral the family had gathered for scarcely 6 weeks earlier. The funeral itself became something larger and stranger than a private family occasion. Given the political climate of Germany in 1937, it drew a mass public gathering and a substantial deployment of soldiers in Nazi uniform, a jarring backdrop to what was, at its centre, simply the burial of a young mother, her husband, and her 2 small sons. There was one moment of genuine, hard-won reconciliation amid the tragedy. Cecilie's parents, Andrew and Alice, who had lived largely separate lives for years, came together for the funeral, the first time they had been in the same place since 1931, and in a detail that feels almost too strange and too sad to be true, but which multiple biographers have documented all the same. The shock and grief of her daughter's death seemed to break through whatever remained of Alice's earlier psychiatric crisis. Her mental state, after the funeral, returned to something like normal for the rest of her long life. It is a genuinely uncomfortable fact of this story that Cecilie's death, in some fashion nobody could have predicted or wanted, appears to have restored the very mother she had spent years quietly trying to reach. Little Johanna, the one child who had stayed behind and survived, was adopted by her uncle Louis and his new wife Margaret. She did not get a long reprieve from the family's run of tragedy. Johanna died of meningitis less than 2 years later, on the 14th of June 1939, at just 2 years old. She was buried alongside her parents and brothers at Rosenhöhe. Back in Scotland, 16-year-old Philip received the news of his sister's death at Gordonstoun, the boarding school where he had been sent years earlier, largely because there was, by that point in his scattered and increasingly rootless childhood, nowhere else settled enough to send him. He learned of it, as so much of his adolescence unfolded, alone, separated by geography and circumstance, from a family that was, even in its moments of shared grief, rarely gathered fully in one place. He did attend the funeral in Darmstadt, and photographs from that day show him, a teenage boy in mourning dress, standing among adult relatives in Nazi uniform, an image that would resurface uncomfortably decades later, stripped of context, whenever commentators wanted to raise questions about Philip's German family connections. It is worth saying plainly what the historical record actually supports. A 16-year-old burying his sister, brother-in-law, and 2 young nephews did not choose the uniforms worn by the adults standing around him, and the presence of those uniforms says a great deal more about Germany in 1937 than it does about him. Cecilie's death, along with the broader dissolution of his childhood family in these same years, as his mother's illness, his father's distance, and his sister's marriages scattered everyone across Europe, left Philip functionally without a settled home for much of his adolescence, raised in fragments by various relatives and the discipline of Gordonstoun itself. It's a piece of history that helps explain something often noted about the adult Philip, a man famous for his self-possession and his reluctance to dwell publicly on sentiment, shaped in part by a series of losses that arrived faster than a teenager could reasonably be expected to process them. Decades later, when the television series The Crown dramatized Cecilie's death for a global audience, it did so with a significant distortion, implying that Philip himself bore some responsibility for his sister boarding that flight. Historians and biographers who have examined the record are clear that this simply wasn't true. Cecilia's decision to travel to London for her brother-in-law's wedding had nothing to do with Philip at all. According to people close to him, the elderly Prince Philip was genuinely hurt by the portrayal, a reminder that even a story more than 80 years old can still land on real people in a real family as something more than distant history. So what do we make, in the end, of Cecilie's short life? 26 years, lived almost entirely within the turbulence of a Europe remaking itself twice over, first through the wars and revolutions of her childhood, then through the catastrophe gathering, largely unseen by her, in the years just before her death. She survived shelling in Athens as a small girl. She survived 2 family exiles, a stateless adolescence, her mother's committal to a psychiatric hospital, and the daily quiet strain of a family living on the generosity of relatives. She found, by most accounts, real happiness in her marriage and her children, and real purpose in her charitable work in Hesse, and then, in the space of a single foggy morning, all of it, the husband, the 2 sons, the 4th child not yet born, the whole quiet life she had built after so much instability, was gone. There's a particular kind of sorrow in a story like this one, because it resists the tidy shape we usually want from history. There's no clean villain here, no single decision that, undone, would have saved her. Just weather that turned worse than expected, a pilot who kept following his flight plan a little too long, and a family already so accustomed to loss that even this, the near total destruction of an entire household in a single crash, became, in time, simply one more chapter in a family history full of them. What Cecilie left behind, in the end, wasn't a kingdom or a title that meant very much by 1937. The Grand Duchy of Hesse had stopped existing as a real political entity nearly 2 decades before her death. What she left behind was a brother who carried her loss quietly for the rest of a very long life, a mother whose fragile grip on the world was, strangely and sadly, steadied by her death, and a family story that would resurface again and again in the biographies and dramatizations of the far more famous life her younger brother went on to lead. If there's a single image worth holding on to from everything we've walked through tonight, I think it's this one, a young woman who spent her entire life being moved by war, by politics, by exile, by the decisions of others, finally, for once, choosing her own direction. Cecilie got on that plane because her husband's family needed her there, because a wedding mattered, because after everything her family had survived together, showing up for one another was simply what they did. The fog that came in off the North Sea that morning had nothing to do with any of that. It was simply weather, arriving at the worst possible moment, in the last hour of an otherwise ordinary flight. She never got to see her 4th child grow up, never got to watch her sons become men, never got to see her little brother marry a young queen and stand, for 70 years, at the edge of a throne that history had denied him any real ambition toward. But somewhere in the archive of that family's long and complicated story, Cecilie remains exactly where the record leaves her, 26 years old, 3 weeks from her birthday, dressed in black for a flight she never wanted to take, carrying a family toward a wedding they never reached.